Welcome to episode 97 of Real Health Radio. You can find the links talked about as part of this episode at the show notes, which is www.7, so the word all spelled out, SEVEN, health.com/97.
Welcome to Real Health Radio. Health advice that's more than just about how you look. And here's your host, Chris Sandel.
Hey guys, and welcome back to another episode of Real Health Radio. Today, it's another one of my guest episodes, and this week's guest is Brian St. Pierre. So Brian is the Director of Performance Nutrition at Precision Nutrition, working with a host of fitness professionals and professional sports teams, including the San Antonio Spurs, the Cleveland Browns, and many more. Prior to his work with Precision Nutrition, Brian worked for 3 years at Cressey Sports Performance as the head of sports nutrition, as the head sports nutritionist, and as a strength and conditioning coach, working with hundreds of athletes and recreational exercises of all types. He's the author of the High Performance Handbook Guide, Nutrition Guide, the Show and Go Nutrition Guide, and the Ultimate Hockey Nutrition. Brian is a registered dietitian with a master's degree in food science and human nutrition. He's also a certified sports nutritionist as well as a certified strength and conditioning specialist. And as part of the Precision Nutrition mission, he helps to deliver life-changing research-driven nutrition coaching for everyone. So I've been a fan of Brian's work for quite a while now. I read most of the articles at Precision Nutrition, which is also known as PN. So I read pretty much all of the articles that they put out. And Brian writes a lot of these articles, or at least co-writes a lot of these articles. And I'd actually emailed Krista Scott-Dixon earlier in the year and asked her about some guest suggestions from PN, and she gave me Brian's details and brought him to my attention again. And I previously had Krista on the show before. She's one of my favorite guests. So once you finish this show, then go check it out. She just is a very eloquent speaker. So on this episode, we actually use a lot of Brian's articles as a starting point for the discussion. So some of the articles that he's written for PN. So the first one is a really recent article that he'd just done, all about sugar. So sugar is endlessly talked about as this supervillain for health and for obesity. So we chat about what the research really shows around this stuff. We talk about grains and are they something we should be avoiding, as is often suggested. And we also cover another article that looked at white potatoes versus sweet potatoes. So sweet potatoes are constantly put on this pedestal where white potatoes regularly get lumped into the same category as white sugar and white bread. So we speak about this and if sweet potatoes are really super superior. So I really enjoyed this conversation with Brian. I kind of wish it could have been longer. Like so much of PN stuff, this really cuts through the noise and the alarmism that is linked to so much of the writing around food. So once you're done with this show, if you're not aware of PN, then I highly suggest checking them out. But I hope you enjoy this show. This is my conversation with Brian St. Pierre. Brian, thanks so much for joining me on the show today.
Thanks for having me, Chris. Looking forward to it.
So with all my guests, I like to just start with them giving a bit of background on themselves. And I know you and your work through Precision Nutrition, which is something we're definitely going to chat about. But do you want to tell people a little about yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. So basically, I'll give like a brief synopsis of my background and my career. I have a bachelor's in human nutrition and dietetics, my master's in, food science and human nutrition. And then I also am a registered dietitian in the U.S. I started my career at Cressey Sports Performance way back 10 plus years ago. I was the first real intern. I was the first employee there. Worked there for about 3 years as a strength coach and nutrition coach, and then moved on to my master's, and then went on to PN from there. So I've been at PN for about 5 years now, a little over 5 years. These days, I'm the Director of Performance Nutrition at Precision Nutrition, and I wear a lot of hats at PN. Like I write articles, I give podcasts, I speak, I handle a lot of our coaching-related stuff, our certification-related things. So that's pretty much, I'd say, my work and background in a nutshell.
Okay. And with Just the sports side of things, were you the guy who played lots of sports at school? And if so, what were the kind of things that you would be doing?
Absolutely. That's actually, in a long story, that's how I actually ended up at Cressey Performance. Growing up, I played like hockey, soccer, and then like baseball and lacrosse were kind of split. And then in college, I played a little bit of junior hockey. And then, once I kind of aged out of that, I ended up playing rugby for a few years at the University of Maine. And then beginning to play men's rugby as I was moved on from school. And that's eventually actually what led me to Cressey Performance was, when you play men's rugby in the U.S. or you're playing college and going to play men's rugby, they look to try to help you, teams that want you to play for them, try to hook you up with a job.
Yeah.
And so a guy there just recommended I get in touch with Eric. This was before Eric even had his own facility. And this was, that long ago. And so I got in touch with Eric, and one thing led to another. Ended up, the day I showed up at the facility was the day they actually got their squat racks, their power racks. So I actually helped Pete Dupuis, the co-owner of Cressey Performance, put together their 3 Elite FTS squat racks without directions. Right, this was early days of online shopping, and so we had to just keep going back into the office, look at a picture on the computer, go back out and put it together. So that was pretty much how that happened. But yeah, I played lots of sports growing up. Still play, men's league hockey today. No more rugby. Those days have passed with three kids and full-time job. But yeah, still playing some sports here and there.
And with the playing sports, obviously growing up, what was the food side of things like growing up? Because obviously you focus a lot on that now, especially at your role in PN, but was food something that was really important to you as well?
Yeah, I mean, when I was really young, maybe not so much, but then as I got older, when I hit about 8th grade or so that was, I was probably 13-ish, 13 going on 14, in that ballpark. My dad ended up losing about 25 pounds. He didn't really talk about his weight loss or dieting, but certainly you saw the difference. And I was old enough to be aware and to notice the change. And we started eating differently as a family, even though my parents didn't really overtly talk about it much. And so I saw my dad get back into exercising, after his kids were a little older, and he'd gotten frustrated, and he used to be lift a lot when I was younger. So he lost 25 pounds, and he's kept it off to this day. So you're talking, 20 years ago, just about. And so I kind of saw that and saw the change, and was interested in exercise, and was interested in how I could fuel my athletic dreams, however limited they might have been.
Yeah.
And so nutrition, became more important to me. And granted, it was very rudimentary. I had some soy protein powder. I bought it a pharmacy and hid under my bed because I didn't think my parents would want to know I was trying protein powder, and it was terrible. So it was things like that. But certainly got interested in it. Started to experiment with it. And spent years really in high school and in college eating to get bigger. Right. I come from a small French Canadian family, so my goal was muscle gain, weight gain, size, strength. So nutrition definitely became more important to me over the course of my high school career. So 14 to 18 years old kind of thing.
And with that, did you always have the science background? Because I guess when I think about myself, I didn't really have a huge science background, but I've been pulled into it more because of my fascination with food and wanting to learn more. But did you already have that interest in science?
Yeah, actually, funnily enough, I didn't actually go to school planning on becoming a dietitian.
Yeah.
I went to college with the goal of becoming an engineer. So I was an engineering major for 3 years in university. So, I have 6 or 7 cousins, all within 10 years of me, all boys or men at this point, who are all engineers. So it's what we do in my mom's side of the family. We're all engineers. Well, I'm not an engineer, but I went to school for engineering for 3 years. So I was good at science and math. I was interested in science and math, and eventually finally came to the conclusion that everyone else had come to, that I should stop being an engineering major and switch over to nutrition, which I eventually did. So I definitely have that math science kind of background, which I think parlayed really nicely into the nutrition domain. That's not actually super common for the nutrition domain. People get into it because they like food or they like cooking. When you look at people who get into like dietetics, for example, but they're not necessarily, obviously they can be, but generally they're not like science heavy or math heavy individuals, which is a background that I came from. So it was, I think it helped in reading science, understanding science, problem solving. That's really what you learn in engineering, is how to solve problems, right? You might have a 2-hour test that has 2 or 3 problems on it, because you're just learning about problem solving. So I think that was really helpful, but definitely have the science background more than I care to admit or remember. But yeah, for sure.
And with your role at Precision Nutrition, how did that come about, and how long have you been there as well?
Yeah, I've been at PN for like just over 5 years. And so basically, I was at Cressey Sports Performance for about 3 years. And I'd always planned on moving back to Maine. I kind of wanted to start my own facility at some point. I'd always told Eric that from the get-go, with a bigger emphasis on nutrition. And then my wife and I were looking to move back. And I got an opportunity to go back to school for my master's and to become a dietitian. So, which was a 2-year program. So when I was coming towards the end of that, I was like in my last 6 months or so, PN sent out an email. I've been following JB for Dr. Berardi for years, since, probably I was in freshman year of college, maybe. I spent more time reading his work than doing my engineering work, to be completely frank, which had its consequences. But,
which is probably
that's
quite a big flag that engineering wasn't for you.
Oh, yes. Yeah, I had folks like my freshman year who, just had only known me since college, who would sit me down and be like, look, Brian, like I know your family thing is engineering and you love science and math, like, but you should do nutrition. And it took me 3 years to finally come to that realization myself, because I was stubborn. But that's a whole other conversation for another day. But then ultimately, they put out an email, looking to hire like a lean eating coach. It was called lean eating back then. They actually ended up hiring a whole bunch of us, 5 or 6 people. And I applied because I figured, what the hell? If I'd worked for anybody else in the field, other than Eric, or then for myself, which had been my plan, it would be JB, right? Who was one of my first influences in the field in general. And so I applied, and I was fortunate. Out of 300 people who applied for that position, that lean eating coach, they ended up hiring myself and another individual, which was really exciting. And so that was way back in 2012. June 1st, 2012 was actually my first official day at Precision Nutrition. So, yeah, it was exciting. It was just, right place, right time. I was wrapping up my schoolwork, so that by the time the job was needed, I was done. Done my schoolwork. I still had to finish my master's thesis, but I was done my internship. I was done my classes. So it worked out really, really well timing wise. But and I've been at PN ever since.
And with PN, I know you've worked with many elite and professional athletes, and if I'm correct, I think you've done nutrition consulting for the San Antonio Spurs and with the Brooklyn Nets, and there's probably a host of others. Mm-hmm. If you're looking at those kinds of people, like, how does it differ working with an athlete compared to working with regular folk? If there is really a difference?
That's a great question, because there is and there isn't. Oftentimes people think, working with elite athletes or pro teams, you're only doing like the cutting edge stuff, right? Fancy nutrient timing strategies, what we would consider at PN like level 2 or level 3 protocols. And there are some individuals like that. In particular, someone like Manu Ginobili, who I worked with at the Spurs. I mean, super inquisitive, very, very interested in nutrition and pushing the boundaries. Most other athletes I've worked with, I've worked with the Cleveland Browns and the Spurs. We worked with the Nets. We're actually heading out to work with the Calgary Flames just a few weeks. That's not that they're athletes. They fall on bell curve just like the regular population. Yeah. You have some guys who just don't care. Most who are reasonably interested, are curious to do a few things differently, and then you have your few outliers who want to know and really push the boundaries of what's possible and have great foundation in place already. And so with those guys, you can play with some things and you can do more fun and experimental things because they have a solid mindset. They're emotionally mature enough to attempt some of those things, and they already have a really strong foundation. But for a lot of guys, it's, okay, let's get some foundational building blocks in place, like getting adequate protein, getting some fruits and vegetables in there, making sure their peri-workout nutrition is on point to support like their incredible amount of training that they do, things of that nature. And oftentimes with a lot of teams, what's in some ways more important than working with the players individually is kind of shaping their eating environment.
Yeah.
So in particular, the Spurs are very, very, very cognizant of this, but many of the teams I've worked with are as well, where it's less about, one-on-one work with the players than it is about, I mean, that's part of it too, but it's also helping to shape the path and make the environment conducive to good nutrition. So auditing what they offer in the cafeteria and their catering companies, what they're offering, and if they have a catering company, or plane food, hotel food on the road, all kinds of things of that nature. So you're having good sources, a nice mix of protein sources, quality carbs, healthy fats, fruits and vegetables, the whole 9 yards there, but also providing it in ways the guys will actually eat it. So if we're just providing chicken breast, broccoli, and brown rice, guys are going to look at it and they have the financial means to just go do something else.
Yeah.
If it's something they're not going to eat. So if it's something that looks enticing and can actually still also help them reach their goals, that's much more. So I'd much rather it be what you might consider like a B-level meal, but they'll actually eat it, than an A-level meal that they wouldn't touch. So we try to find that balance between, really high quality, really, really healthy meals with meals, and make sure they're presented in a way and taste in a way that the guys will actually be excited and enticed to consume it and eat it on a consistent basis. Otherwise, it's actually not helping, because they just end up walking out of the facility and stopping by Chick-fil-A on their way home, and eat that. So, that's what you often see, right? These guys have oftentimes they're young, they don't have a lot of cooking skills. They don't come from a background where that's like their thing. They maybe don't have a desire to cook. So they need to have options that are available, that are solid, and that are tasty, that they'll actually consume.
And I think that's a really important point, and it's relevant not just for people who are an athlete, but in kind of every walk of life. I think too much of the focus is on perfection in terms of what would be the absolute best choice or the absolute best meal, as opposed to what's the best option I can make in the available environment, and just being a lot more realistic, which is one of the big things that I really like about Pierre. And there's just a very realistic, down-to-earth feel to it. And the other thing I would say is, when I read through, I get the impression that you work with people and with regular folks, because so often when I read websites, you can tell that it's research heavy, but someone hasn't spent the time with real people. Like, yes, this works in a laboratory. It doesn't work when you're having to work with someone who has a real life and has all of these other demands. So are there other things that you would maybe comment on or notice that you've learned purely by practicing that you just wouldn't have been able to pick up from textbooks?
I would say the biggest thing I tend to, or I've picked up and I tend to try to reiterate to other fitness professionals, especially young ones or people new to the field, is, there's a new push towards like being evidence-based, right? Kind of like what you're which is awesome. You should be evidence-based, but your clients are not research averages, right? Research reports averages. Yeah. X leads to 30% decreased risk of Y. That's true on average. When you look at the individual data, it doesn't hold true that way. Some people saw no benefit. Some saw even more benefit. Some saw like harm from that food. And so it's important to remember that people are not averages. So, you're actually coaching individuals. When something quote unquote should work because research says it does, remember that. Like, they could be the outlier or part of the statistical norm, right? That they're one standard deviation away, or however you want to frame it, where they're not going to respond the same way as the average, because you rarely find a person who fits the average on all of those, every single research question asked. Yeah. So you're coaching real people. I can't stress that enough. And I think you really hit the nail on the head when you talked about, you got to adjust it to people's actual life circumstances, doing the best you can in the circumstances presented to you, the socioeconomic circumstances, your environmental circumstances. I mean, you name it. There are so many elements at play that affect people's food intake or why they eat what they eat, their ethnicity, their culture, the list goes on and on. to realize that research is awesome. I write a lot of really research heavy pieces, but in the end, I try to always tie it back to how do you apply this in real life with real people? And that's usually taking a more nuanced approach, testing things to see how you or each person you work with actually responds, right? And that's why we really suggest and recommend two things. One, being a nutritional agnostic, so not having one particular camp or strategy that you follow and advocate. It's okay if it works for you, but it's not going to work for everybody. And two, using outcome-based decision-making. So meaning just because something should work or data tells you it's supposed to work, if you're trying it with a client and it's not working, right, don't just paleo harder. Actually use that data and make an informed decision, right? Change something, try something else, and see what happens. So use those outcomes and then make decisions based on those outcomes, not just on what you think should be happening, but on what is happening.
Yeah, and I 100% agree with that, and that is definitely how I've practiced and have learned to practice over the years, because probably like everyone starting out, I learned that what I thought I knew and should work with clients often didn't. And so it just through time, you start to learn, well, okay, yes, in theory, this should work, but I know with this person, it's not working so well. And so just being open-minded like that, I think is the strength of a good coach.
And it's oftentimes that comes with experience, right? You learn that the hard way. We've all learned that the hard way. Like, why isn't this working? Works for me, and it works for my 3 other athlete friends, right? But it's not working for this 40-year-old mother of 3 that I'm working with for the first time, because their life circumstances are way different than a 22-year-old single guy, right, who can revolve his life around training. That's just one example, but that's how I learned it, the really hard way, like just got slapped in the face by reality. And so I think experience is the best teacher in that regard. But if you can go into coaching with your eyes wide open for that, you might not have to learn it such a hard way that I did.
Yeah. So look, one of the things I really like about you at PN is the articles that you write for them. And so I would love to chat about some of them. I don't know how many we're going to get through here. But you wrote a recent article on sugar. It's only just come out, and I think I would love to chat with you about that. I guess the first question I want to ask is slightly different in just, you wrote that article with Krista Scott-Dixon. I know you've written other articles with other people. What is it like writing an article, especially of that length and that detail, with someone else?
Yeah, that's a good question. There are different ways we do it. It depends on the piece. So that piece in particular, I wrote, my job for that one was to write the really science-heavy part of it, like look into the data, what does it show us? What do we know? What do we not know? And kind of emphasize that stuff. And then in this regard, I kind of just passed it off to Krista, and then she really took it and shaped it into like, an actual story, not just like a research review. And honestly, Krista is incredible. Like, words just fall out of that woman. Yeah. She writes, and it took me, quite a while to put that together. And for her, it's just like, okay, here's my edited piece. Like, it seems like an hour later. So she's incredible when it comes to writing, but she just does a great job putting it into a really science heavy piece that I tried to make as, for lack of a better term, layperson friendly as possible. But Krista does such a good job of making it relatable. She came up with a lot of the ideas for like the visual representations, the charts and the graphs, to really help make things visual. So it wasn't just like 8,000 words on paper. Yeah. So in that regard, that's kind of how we handled this one. But other ones in the past, like The Cost of Getting Lean, is a piece I co-wrote with Ryan Andrews. It's to this day our most read piece ever. We wrote that one kind of together. Like, we did it in sections and we discussed it. It was a concept that the two of us just kind of discussed and came up with. So that was a piece where we really wrote collaboratively. We do it on Google Drive, so you can kind of work together and discuss pieces and put comments. And obviously, once Krista was writing this, I had input and things I thought should be adjusted based on how she reworded stuff. So with a piece like this, it was much more like a pass the baton, whereas other pieces in the past have been more collaborative. It really all depends on the topic and how it just takes shape. There's not necessarily always one rhyme or reason to how we produce it, but we do tend to have an editorial system.
Okay, and so let's then just talk a little bit about that article. Do you want to I don't know, give a snapshot of what was a very long article. I was saying to Brian before I got on this call that I read it today, and it took me about 40 minutes to read through. And if I'm being honest, there were bits that I was trying to skip through because I was realizing how long it would take me. So it is a behemoth of an article, but yeah, if you can do your best to summarize it.
Yeah, no, and like we were also saying before, it was, like I said, it was 34 pages long in Google Drive after I had written it. So it was no joke. It was no joke to write, let me tell you. It took me more than 40 minutes. So, I would say the best way to sum it up is that sugar has gotten a really bad rap recently. Some of it deserved, and some of it not. I mean, sugar is not a health food. I would in no way encourage excess sugar consumption or aim to consume sugar intentionally, significantly. It doesn't contribute value other than taste. There's no nutrients. There's nothing truly physiologically beneficial about sugar. However, right, humans are inherently wired to like sugar and to seek out sugar because it's delicious. And there's nothing wrong with having some delicious food. But sugar itself is not inherently harmful or inherently individually fattening in some surprising way. It provides calories, right? It can make it easier to overeat foods when there are excess sugar added to them, or there's a combination of sugar and fat, salt. Those three things together with flavor enhancers override the brain's normal mechanisms that tell you you're full. So sugar is definitely a contributing factor to obesity today. But to single out any one item, including sugar, ignores biological complexity. I think it makes us feel good. It makes us feel like, there's one thing we can focus on, and that's just going to solve our problems. But that's not reality, right? It's obesity is multifactorial, like most issues we face today, like heart disease, like cancer. There unfortunately is no one answer. It's a whole series of answers, or a whole series of things that coincide and work together to drive this obesity epidemic we're seeing today. So this is a long synopsis, I guess. But ultimately, I would say sugar is not a health food. Everyone's response to sugar is different. Some people do feel like they get addicted to it or have a really hard time handling it. And there is some evidence for that. So they should probably significantly limit their sugar. For most, they can probably take in a relatively moderate amount, 10% of their calories or less, so long as they're not overeating calories in general. But sugar is not inherently fattening or dangerous. You try to eat as many sugar packets as you can in one day, just sugar packets, and tell me how far you get. You're not going to get that far. Right? It's by itself, it's not overly palatable, but when it's combined with other things, particularly fats and salts, that's when it becomes very, very pleasurable and overrides our satiety mechanisms.
And in terms of sugar being problematic, when it is problematic, is that when it's more refined and add into palatable foods, or do you see concerns, or does the data bring out concerns from someone, say, eating lots of fruit or lots of potatoes or that kind of thing?
Great question. No, the data does not support fruit or inherently whole food versions of sugar to be much or any concern. I mean, in theory, it could be if you're eating. I once had a client eating more than 8 servings of fruit per day, which was contributing to overall excess calories. So we just pulled that back to 4 servings per day, and he was doing great. Now, it wasn't that the fruit itself was inherently fattening, but he was eating an excessive amount to the point where it was contributing to excess calories. Now, but the data seems to indicate when you look at, they've done trials that compared people eating 0 to 1 servings of fruit per day versus 3 to 4 servings of fruit per day with the same amount of calories, and they lost the same amount of weight. However, the fruit group actually had better markers of inflammation, actually lost more from their waist, some markers like that. So there's some evidence that it potentially is extra beneficial. And we know all the health benefits that can come from a reasonable amount of fruit intake. So the biggest concern the biggest concern is sugar-sweetened beverages. So your sodas in particular, but even things like sports drinks, fruit juices, right, that are very, very rich sources of sugar. And especially when we take them in a liquid form and we're not chewing them and eating them, you're getting a much more dense version, and your body doesn't tend to recognize that as well in terms of a calories coming in.
Yeah.
And so it's a much easier way to overeat. And the data is much more significantly correlated to problems with sugar sweetened beverages than just sugar itself. But when refined sugar or high fructose corn syrup or any of its alternatives are put into processed palatable foods, that's where you really start to run into issues, because they're basically designed to stimulate your brain, right? Your reward system, your hedonic system, which is like the actual pleasure taste system. They're designed to overstimulate those systems and to override their mechanisms, so that, as Lay's potato chips would say, bet you can't eat just one. Like it's a very clever marketing tool, but it's actually exactly how it's engineered.
Yeah.
Right? It's designed to make it so you can't just eat one. It's designed to override that. So sugar contributes to that when it's combined in other foods of that nature. But like I said before, if you just drank sugar water without flavoring, without carbonation, it's not nearly as palatable. Right? It's much harder to overconsume. But when it's combined with other elements, that's when it really, especially in other highly processed products, that's where it just becomes so much easier to overeat and consume excess calories.
Yeah. And that's where I think the focus for most people should be around processed foods or around highly palatable foods. I find it quite ironic that the stuff that people talk about today, say, oh, people are having, I don't know, donuts or cookies or etc. And the problem with them is the sugar content. If we went back to the 80s, they'd be saying you shouldn't be having donuts, you shouldn't be having biscuits, you shouldn't be having the same foods, but it would have been the fat content.
Exactly.
And we've just changed the villain despite the same foods being in play.
Mm-hmm. And it's the same mistake, right? We made the same exact mistake then, where we over-exaggerated the claims on the dangers of fats. When you look at the actual evidence, we are over-exaggerating the claims on the dangers of sugar. Now, in extreme excess, absolutely, it's certainly problematic. But that's only really so when we're over-consuming calories in general. And donuts contributing plenty of fat and sugar, right, in a very delicious and rather small package. So it's very easy to consume excessive calories because it's more energy dense, it's tasty, it's delivering a nice combination of fat and sugar, it smells amazing. We're in an environment where everybody else is eating them. The list goes on and on. But you hit the nail on the head. I love that analogy, right? It's the same food, we just villainize a different nutrient in it, when really it's the food itself.
Yeah. And I think probably the same with those kind of foods. The damage comes more from the foods that you're now not eating than the actual food. So the fact that you're eating that pushes out so much more fruits and vegetables, or it means that you don't have then some fish with lunch or whatever. And so yes, I think the processed foods can be problematic in of themselves, but I think a lot of the damage comes from what someone is then, like the opportunity cost from an economic standpoint of missing out on those other things.
Yeah, that's certainly part of it, right? So it's the combination of, eating excessive amounts of nutrient-poor foods like donuts, and then missing out on the nutrient-dense foods like fruits and vegetables. So it's a double whammy in reality.
Yeah. So you wrote another article that I'd love to chat about. It was on grains, and I know grains have taken quite a bashing in the health sphere for quite a while, with books like Grain Brain and Wheat Belly, very catchy titles.
Yes.
Do you want to talk a little about this? And one thing I would say is, with all the PN stuff, there is no date on when the article was put out. So I'm sorry if this was written 4 years ago and you can't remember what you said. So my apologies on that front.
Yeah, no, I know. It's honestly, I don't know why we do that. There is no timestamp. I wrote this probably about 2 years ago would be my guess on this piece. Whereas the sugar one I just wrote in the past few months, and it's just got published today or yesterday, something like that. So the Great Grain Debate. Yeah. So this was definitely a piece in some ways near and dear to my heart, because my master's thesis was actually on wheat. So I learned more about wheat than I probably ever cared to. Intricacies of growing methods and soil pH, and I've forgotten more about it than I probably remember, and that's okay. But because of that, I read a ton and a lot of papers on it as I was doing my thesis. And so then, not too long after, these books started coming out, right? Your Wheat Belly and your Grain Brain. And there's a kernel of truth there. There are some people who don't tolerate grains well, who feel really crummy when they eat a significant amount of grains. And so for those folks, just like folks who actually feel addicted to sugar or feel like they can't control their sugar intake, they shouldn't consume grains or they shouldn't consume sugar, right? Again, the research average doesn't necessarily support that, but when you look at the individual responses within the data itself, there is support for that. So that's where, again, I go back to you're coaching real people, not averages, right? The average might not support it, but within that average, there are always folks where that actually is the case. What's really interesting is oftentimes the argument against grains is, humans have only consumed them really recently, only since the shift to agriculture in the Neolithic age, approximately 10,000 years ago. And actually, fundamentally, that's not true. It's the same thing with legumes. There's evidence for grain and legume consumption for millions of years, since actually before we became humans, before we became hominids. There's evidence of grain consumption for up to about 4 million years ago. And so, there's been stuff found, like pestle and mortar and that kind of stuff for, very, very crude versions, but for grinding grains tens and thousands of years ago, well before the agricultural revolution. Now, it wasn't what it is today or what it became as we really shifted to agriculture, but they certainly consumed grains in some capacity or another for hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years. So that Paleolithic perspective there of, well, it's a new food is not supported by the data. And when you actually look at the things that are supposed to cause problems from grains, they're supposed to cause inflammation. On average, that doesn't hold up. You look at the data, not one single controlled trial has shown that grains increase inflammation on average. Are there individuals where that could be the case? Probably. I'm not aware of it in any case study or any literature. But the fact is there are people who have food sensitivities. Like if you have celiac disease, it's not the grain itself, but the gluten in the grain will cause inflammation. So you could make the argument, right, that wheat causes inflammation in those people, and that's true. So there is evidence there, and there are certainly people who maybe don't have celiac disease but do feel really crummy from eating grains. So I'm not against some people removing it, but to insinuate that grains as a category should be avoided by all people just makes no sense to me. There's no evidence for that. There's no reason for that. You don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? You don't extrapolate the needs of a few, which they exist, to the needs of everybody. So in my book and in PN's perspective, look at the data and look at the anti-nutrient argument. It doesn't really hold up. Like the data on lectins and phytic acid and protease inhibitors doesn't show on the whole what's often claimed, right? Lectins are actually used by the body for a lot of basic functions. They could even probably reduce tumor growth and decrease incidence of certain diseases. And like there's some cool benefits from reasonable amounts. Now you could consume excessive amounts and cause issues, but that would require a pretty skewed overall intake. Same thing with like phytic acid. There's some evidence that reasonable amounts of phytic acid probably actually have a number of health benefits. In excess, it can cause problems. So you look at any of these nutrients, and in isolation, you could argue that they're harmful. But in a broader context of someone's like well-balanced intake with a nice mix of lean proteins and various carbohydrates, fruits and vegetables and healthy fats, the data does not support it in any way on the whole. So this is where we start. We tend to start people towards that middle moderate ground. But then we help them experiment and test things on themselves, not based on how they, quote unquote, should work, but how they're actually working, right? Oh, you actually feel a lot better when you remove grains? Awesome. Well, then let me help you get some other quality carbohydrate sources in there to ensure you're still meeting your carb needs. Oh, removing grains didn't do anything for you? Cool. Let's keep rocking with the grains, right? No big deal. So you just experiment and test and use outcome-based decision making. But when you start at one extreme, all grains removed, or all grains and legumes and nuts and dairy, what the hell's left to eat, right? Where do you go from there? So we tend to start much more in the middle and then pull things away as the evidence leads us to try and test and then see what happens, versus starting at one extreme end and maybe having to make your way all the way to the other end. So that's a long-winded take, but that's probably where I would end up in terms of grain discussion.
Yeah. And look, I agree with everything you said there. And I find, I mean, for me personally, I don't actually eat that many grains. I don't feel great on it. I'm more gluten type stuff, so I don't eat a lot of wheat or bread, but I eat a ton of rice because I do really well on rice, and it suits my body.
And rye contains, right, it contains gluten, you know?
Yeah. So yeah, that's what I've discovered and works for me. I do find with clients, often they're not necessarily sensitive to wheat or to gluten until they hit some kind of threshold. And so we work out, okay, like if you're having, I don't know, a piece of toast once a day, it's fine. But if you're having it 3 meals a day, it starts to really affect you. And so we realize that, okay, there's probably an upper limit on this stuff and we can sort out some other carbohydrates. But I'm the same. I want to start from the place of we can include everything, and then we can remove things as we get justification for why we should remove things, as opposed to the other way around of you've got this list of 10 foods and maybe we'll add some more stuff in later on.
Exactly. But I think you touched it, right? There's a dose-response relationship. Some people could have grains all day and feel awesome, right? There are vegetarians. There are people who follow like an Ornish-style diet. They eat a ton of grains and they report feeling awesome. But that's not everybody. And so you got to kind of find that threshold where, you know, it's either not causing any problems or you still feel really good, you know, whatever your marker is. But I think that's a perfect way to go about it for sure.
Cool. So the final piece I want to just mention about, and this one, you said the grains one is close to your heart. This one's probably a little bit closer to mine, which was on like white potatoes versus sweet potatoes. And the reason I say this is something close to my heart is I love white potatoes. I enjoy huge amounts of them. I like eating sweet potatoes, but they're, in my estimation, a very poor substitute from a taste perspective and how it leaves my body feeling. So when I look at the world of health, like sweet potatoes are put up on this crazy pedestal and people are told to avoid white potatoes, almost putting them in the same category of processed foods, like that kind of derogatory nature that they're talked about. So maybe you could share a little bit of your thoughts that you wrote about in that piece.
Yeah. Krista and I definitely collaborated on this one, mainly because it was a debate we had internally. Maybe not a debate. It was a friendly conversation, because even in our PN coaching program, when I first started, we tended to do the same thing, right? They recommended sweet potatoes over white potatoes. And Krista was the writer of our content, our curriculum, and I was like, well, why, right? I was always a thorn in her side, going through it and kind of questioning things or asking questions and wondering why we did something and why we recommended X, Y, or Z. And so she's like, oh, well, because of blah, blah, blah. And I would counter. We had a really friendly conversation back and forth where she was like, you know what? We should turn this into an article. This was really great. So we ended up changing some of the recommendations in the course itself to reflect that. And I think it's because for whatever reason, there became this, well, part of it, I think, was with the low-carb phenomenon, right, and the paleo movement, and not having nightshade vegetables, which potatoes fall into that category. So there was this push in that regard. And then originally, paleo was married to CrossFit, and that was like a low-fat or a low-carb paleo and a CrossFit, which people ended up finding didn't pair very well long-term because of the high-intensity output requires glucose, and when you're not providing glucose, that'll catch up to you eventually. And so we saw that a lot in the field. Then it became safe starches got added to paleo, right? Things like sweet potatoes, even like white rice now sometimes you see, and other elements like that. So interestingly, that was kind of how it seemed to occur organically within the industry itself. So potatoes kind of got pushed to the side as well. You saw, data from like observational studies where they said, they put potatoes in the same category as like white bread and other white foods. But the problem was they were oftentimes not separating out like whole food versions of potatoes, a baked potato or a roasted potato, from French fries or potato skins. So they were all lumped in one category in the observational data. So obviously they were ending up looking like unhealthy foods. But when you look at the research on actual like baked potatoes or boiled potatoes or what have you, it's a very different story. And so, we did some some work and some discussion. We made an article, even an infographic on the topic, where we compared like a medium baked potato with a medium sweet potato, which originally it wasn't compared that way until I was looking at the infographic. They were comparing like 100 grams of each. And I'm like, no one eats 100 grams of a potato. They eat whatever the size it comes in, right? Like they buy it at the store. No one, I mean, some people, I guess, are weighing it, but most folks are not weighing their food every day when they cook it or make it. So they might eat a hand-sized portion of each, right? Like a medium-sized potato, regardless of whether it's white or sweet. So that's how we should compare things, because that's how people actually eat them. And so when we put the comparison that way, ended up becoming really interesting where, yes, the white potato had more calories and it had more carbs. It is more carb dense. It has less water. But fiber content was the same. Protein content was higher for the white potato. Vitamin and minerals, they were all kind of offsetting. Sweet potatoes were higher in 7 different ones, and white potatoes were higher in 7 other ones. So they were pretty even across the board there. All told, I mean, pretty much a wash. When you look at the glycemic index or glycemic load, which I'm not a big fan of.
Me neither.
Because it just doesn't represent the food as a whole. It's just one. It's like not eating eggs just because they contain cholesterol, right? That's not representative of the entirety of a food. A food is a complex matrix of hundreds, if not thousands, of compounds. To try and boil it down to just its its effects on blood glucose by itself in isolation doesn't really work out very well, because people don't eat just a potato, right? They eat a potato with a protein, with some vegetables and some healthy fats, which will drastically alter how it affects your blood sugar. Not to mention, when you compare it to the actual, there's been a research looking at the satiety index, which is measuring how satisfied a food makes you feel, how long it keeps you full, or how full it leaves you feeling after a certain amount of time. The boiled potato was by far the highest on the satiety index. Almost an extreme outlier, because it was so satisfying for most people. And then it was like oatmeal or porridge was soon after, then like some proteins, and obviously the most energy dense foods, your biscuits and your donuts and things like that, were at the lowest end. Right? But something like a boiled potato was by far the most satiating. And what I find most interesting is there's this big push against sugar lately, right? Like this big, a lot of talk about the evils of sugar. But people love sweet potatoes versus white potatoes. But a sweet potato has a relatively, for a vegetable or for a starchy food, relatively significant amount of sugar in it. So I just find that so, like the cognitive dissonance there, I just find it so fascinating. You know, when you actually compare the two, the sugar content of a sweet potato is much higher. Like 6.5% of the weight of the sweet potato is sugar versus 1% in a white potato. So, I mean, a small little factoid, but something I just find interesting, you know, just from my nerdy science background.
Yeah. And look, I will link to all of the articles we chatted about, as well as the infographic, because, the infographic is something, or infographics in general is something PN does very well, but it's in particular the one for the sweet potato versus white potato I found was really helpful, and it explains this in a very easy way. So Brian, I'm aware that we're coming up to our end time. I know you have another call you need to jump onto. Before we wrap up, where can people go to find out more information about you or about PN? And if there's anything that you want to kind of shout about or promote, feel free to do so.
Yeah, I mean, they can just go to precisionnutrition.com. From there, you can find, everything that we do, the coaching that we offer, the certifications that we offer. If you're a fitness professional, if you really want to learn more about us, we have a 5-day free course where you can get like a daily email and get a little video and get some forms if you're like a fitness professional, to really learn what our coaching philosophy is all about and how we go about it. So that's probably like the best way to really understand what it is we do and how we do it, where you get just a really nice overall like synopsis of our approach. I would say precisionnutrition.com. Check out our free articles, check out the 5-day free course, and whatever else you want to peruse on the site, and see what we're up to. But we speak all over the world. We obviously write pieces and we get on podcasts like this. So, this is what we do and we're passionate about it.
Cool. Well, look, thank you so much for joining me on the show today. As I said, I'm a big fan of your writing, and it was really nice to finally be able to chat with you.
Yeah, this was great, man. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.